The Greeks lived between water and stone in a way that shaped everything they did. The drama begins at the coastline where the sea offers opportunity and the mountains refuse companionship. The first idea you need to hold is simple but powerful. Landscape guided minds more strongly than rulers. And the Greek mind was a child of sea breezes and cliff faces. If you look at a map of the ancient Greek world, you will see fragmentation rather than unity. The coastline is cut into fingers and inlets, backed by serrated mountain ridges that isolate pockets of human life. That fragmentation matters because it made travel by land slow and expensive, and it made the sea not just convenient, but necessary for connection between people and ideas. The Mediterranean environment itself behaved like a character in Greece's story, with predictable winds and a temperate pulse that repeated each year. Seasonal changes in wind and sea created regular routes and windows for travel, shaping when and how commerce and warfare could happen. That regularity allowed Greeks to build calendars of safe passage and to specialize in maritime skills, turning environmental rhythms into the backbone of their economy and culture. The sea became a highway long before roads did, and Greek lives grew oriented around harbors and bays. Seafarers regarded the sea like an extension of their homes, and mariners learned to read winds, currents, and stars as if they were family. Greek shipbuilding and navigation evolved out of necessity and curiosity at the same time. Simple hulls became faster vessels, and the navigation knowledge passed from one generation to the next like a precious secret. This technology multiplied possibilities, turning isolated communities into nodes in networks that spanned coasts, islands, and foreign ports across the Mediterranean basin. When Greece's population and ambition outgrew its arable valleys, colonization became the solution, and the sea became the highway. City-states sent expeditions across blue horizons to found colonies that brought land, resources, and strategic footholds back to mother cities. Those colonies were not imperial provinces but extensions of kinship and trade, seeding Hellenic culture across Sicily, Asia Minor, and the Black Sea in a pattern driven by geography, rather than conquest alone. Trade was the circulatory system of Greek civilization, and the sea functioned as its arteries transporting pottery, metal, grain, and ideas. Markets in different city-states specialized, creating economic interdependence that softened the blow of local scarcity. Trade networks also created cultural exchange, spreading artistic styles, religious concepts, and technological know-how, making the Mediterranean a shared cultural laboratory rather than a patchwork of unrelated folkways. The sea did more than move goods, it reshaped politics by empowering maritime powers to project influence across water. Cities with strong navies could protect trade, collect tribute, and create alliances that changed the balance of power. Athens provides a clear example where naval dominance funded cultural patronage and political experimentation, proving the sea could be both economic engine and instrument of political transformation. Mountains in Greece were defensive walls and stubborn neighbors that forced political fragmentation rather than coherent unity. Each valley and plateau often became a separate world with unique customs, dialects, and rivalries. That geographical isolation encouraged the development of states that prized local autonomy and cultivated fierce civic identities tied to specific landscapes and shared histories. The polis emerges from this mountain logic as a practical solution to local realities and small-scale governance. Citizens organized around defensible acropolis and accessible ports, balancing the need for protection with access to trade. These small-scale political units incentivized a political imagination that valued participation, reputation, and communal decision-making in ways that larger empires often did not encourage. Farming in Greece was a puzzle solved on rocky, uneven slopes, where soil depth varied dramatically from one plot to another. The limited arable land forced farmers to specialize in crops suited to steep terrain and marginal soils. That agricultural reality pushed communities toward olives and grapes, plants that thrive on slopes where cereals struggled, and that agricultural turn shaped diets, trade commodities, and cultural rituals for centuries. Olives and grapes are not only crops, they are environmental solutions tailored to Mediterranean climates and poor soils. These resilient plants required less water and could thrive where wheat fields would fail, giving Greeks a dependable economic base. The choice of these crops had ripple effects across society, from culinary habits to religious offerings, and reinforced a landscape economy built around durable perennials rather than annual grain dependence. Herding and pastoralism provided mobility and flexibility in a land where fixed agriculture could be risky and uncertain. Shepherds moved flocks along mountain tracks in a seasonal rhythm that connected valleys and coasts in a web of economic exchange. This mobility created cultural patterns of transhumance and grazing rights that shaped local governance, property norms, and sometimes produced conflict over scarce pastures where environmental constraints forced competition. Environmental challenges like drought, soil erosion, and deforestation were constant threats that tested Greek resilience and ingenuity. Overuse of hillsides for wood, grazing, and cultivation accelerated erosion and reduced soil fertility over generations. These cumulative pressures drove communities to innovate in land management, to ration resources, and sometimes to seek new lands overseas when local carrying capacity collapsed under human pressure. Water scarcity in many regions forced the Greeks to develop pragmatic technologies for capture and storage of rainwater and runoff. Wells, cisterns, and simple reservoirs became essential infrastructure for towns perched on rocky slopes without reliable rivers. Managing scarce water resources influenced settlement patterns, seasonal migrations, and even diplomatic relations between communities that contested access to vital springs and streams. Faced with these limitations, Greeks adapted economically and politically in ways that became central to their identity. Colonization relieved demographic pressure, while trade and naval investment created wealth that bypassed limited agricultural yields. The combination of maritime expansion and local autonomy formed a feedback loop where environmental constraints encouraged outward-looking solutions that transformed Greek society and culture over centuries. Cultural consequences followed from environmental conditions as surely as crops followed from soil type. Civic institutions emphasizing assembly, debate, and shared responsibility were practical responses to small-scale communities needing cooperation to manage scarce resources. Philosophy, law, and public rituals emerged in landscapes where face-to-face accountability mattered, where commons needed policing, and where decisions about shared water or pastures could mean survival or failure. Myths and religions in Greece grew from topography and weather, with sea gods and mountain spirits providing narrative meaning to environmental hazards. Poseidon, the fickle sea god, and Zeus enthroned on high peaks gave voice to forces people experienced daily. These stories helped communities cope with unpredictable elements, providing cultural frameworks that explained storms and droughts, while reinforcing social rituals that bound groups together in the face of environmental uncertainty. Warfare and defense strategies were also influenced directly by topography, producing hoplite formations and fortified acropolis adapted to hills and narrow passes. Armies planned campaigns around mountain choke points and coastal approaches that constrained movement. The result was a military culture that prized local knowledge of terrain and invested in portable, citizen soldiers who could defend their city with intimate understanding of the land. Economic technologies like pottery metallurgy and shipwrighting developed in direct response to resource distributions across the landscape. Clay deposits and mineral outcrops shaped local industries, producing specialized products that found markets across the sea. This specialization linked environmental endowment to cultural output, so that somewhere as geology determined yet another city's craft reputation and economic leverage in distant marketplaces. Urban design in Greece answered to slopes and defensive needs more than abstract aesthetic ideals, leading to hillside cities with terraces, stairways, and acropolis perched for surveillance. Architects used available stone and local topography to create spaces that felt both practical and sacred. These built responses to environmental constraints created a distinctive skyline and urban experience that reinforced civic identity and practical governance through physical form. Human actions fed back into the environment, creating long-term consequences that later generations had to face. Deforestation for fuel and shipbuilding reduced soil stability, and soil loss diminished agricultural productivity in many regions. Understanding these historical environmental feedbacks helps explain cycles of prosperity and decline, and it shows how human choices compounded natural limitations into systemic problems. The legacy of Greece's environment is visible in political ideas and cultural practices that influenced the wider Mediterranean and later Western thought. Democratic practices born in small, land-limited communities and maritime networks that spread ideas both owe their shapes to geography. When we read Plato or watch Athenian drama, we are encountering cultural forms that were refined in a world where sea lanes and rocky soil were everyday realities, shaping thought and value. Comparing Greek responses to environment with other Mediterranean cultures reveals both shared solutions and uniquely Greek adaptations based on their terrain. Egyptians organized large centralized systems around a great river, while Greeks decentralized because their hills encouraged local autonomy. These contrasts show that environment does not determine culture absolutely, but it channels political imagination and technological choices into distinct historical pathways. Modern cities and policymakers can still learn from ancient Greek adaptations to climate and landscape, particularly how small communities manage scarce resources through cooperation. Strategies like diversified economies, water capture, and maritime connectivity have parallels in contemporary resilience planning. Learning from ancient successes and failures offers practical insights for sustainable land use and water policy in similarly constrained environments today. In the end, the story of Greece is a reminder that environment and human culture are partners in a long negotiation that never truly ends. Mountains taught independence, the sea taught connection, and climate taught pragmatism, together, helping to produce a civilization that questioned, argued, and experimented with life. If this exploration shifted how you picture ancient Greece, remember that landscapes are not background scenery but active participants in history, and that lesson is as urgent now as it ever was. The philosophical twist is that geography shaped Greek ideas about freedom and participation as much as philosophers did through argument. Small landscape, constrained communities required public engagement and accountability. And those civic habits became philosophical commitments that traveled far beyond rocky shores. Recognizing this connection helps us see political ideals as environmental responses as much as intellectual inventions, a perspective that reframes how we read history and what lessons we bring forward. So what remains of that ancient conversation between sea and stone in our modern world, and why should we care about the particular contours of Greek geography right now? The answer is simple and unsettling, because modern climate change will demand adaptations as profound as those Greeks once made. If ancient communities had to reorganize agriculture, migrate across seas, and invent institutions to manage scarce water, then modern societies would do well to study these precedents before acting blindly and repeating past mistakes. The final scene is a call to curiosity and to action, because the story of ancient Greece is also a mirror for our ecological future. Landscape and human choice are inseparable, and the choices we make now will determine how future historians interpret our civilization. If this investigation gave you a new perspective on history and environment, hit subscribe to keep exploring how geography quietly shapes the human story.